Hello, my name is Tammy Rose, and welcome to Concord Days. We're here as part of Transcendental Concord, and my guest for today is the amazing Dr. Robert Gross.
Hi there.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm fine. It's a gray, wet day, but the spirits are still rising in Concord.
I love to hear that. And do you have any quotes that you would like to start off with?
Sure. So the first is from Emerson. He says that the former men acted and spoke under the thought that a shining social prosperity was the aim of men, and they compromised ever the individuals to the nation. The modern mind teaches in extremes that the nation exists for the individual, for the guardianship and education of every man. The second quote is from Thoreau, who says, "The history of the world, it has been justly observed, is the history of the progress of humanity. The characteristic of our epoch is perfect freedom, freedom of thought and action. It has generated an unusual degree of energy and activity. It has generated the commercial spirit. Man thinks faster and freer than ever before. He is more restless for the reason that he is more independent than ever. The ruling principle of the commercial spirit is a blind and unmanly love of wealth."
I love those. Those are so distinctive. And why did you choose them? Can I ask?
Yeah, so first I'll pose a question.
Okay.
Which came first? I mean, not in my reading, but chronologically, the Emerson or the Thoreau quotation?
So I love that the Emerson quote sounds as if he's talking about what the men of his time were thinking. And I want to say like he's thinking like of the revolutionary era, right? Where it's the nation versus the person.
Mm-hmm.
So that would make me think that it would be dated later, maybe like the anniversary of, the revolution or something like that. And also because you're asking me and you read them sort of in that chronological order, it makes me think that you would be tricky and sort of purposely do them out of order. Um, and the quote from Thoreau, I want it sounds like something that's contemporaneous to when he's working on Walden. But I wouldn't be surprised if he did it ahead of time.
Well, I quote both passages in the Transcendentalists and Their World.
And I haven't been able to get through it yet, although I'm working on it.
That's okay. I see there's a lot of little tabs there.
Yep.
I quote both passages, not in the same chapter. And when I typed them up in response to your pick out a couple quotations, it struck me very interesting that the Thoreau quotation comes from the remarks he made in his commencement part when he graduated from Harvard on August 30th, 1837.
Wow. Yeah. Cool.
The Emerson quotation is from his lectures that he gave at the Masonic Temple in Boston on the theme, the philosophy of modern history. And you can see there now that I have to go back to remember the exact date, unless you can pick it up. There we are. Yeah. So the Emerson quotation is from December 6th, 1837.
Oh, wow.
So you think to yourself, that's pretty interesting. The Emerson, think of what we have here. Two men at different phases of their lives who are reflecting on the characteristics of our age. First of all, it is a remarkable moment in intellectual history when people can stand back and say, let me grasp the age. the impulse to do that actually comes from Thomas Carlyle, who had published important essays on the spirit of the times. Does a time have a spirit? Does an age have a characteristic impulse? That sounds like everybody's a major in American studies.
Right.
So, but Thoreau imagines that the driving force of the age is a greater freedom on the part of the individual to pursue self-interest. And he's disappointed that the pursuit has stopped with the accumulation of wealth.
Right.
He thinks that it can actually be carried in a much higher level, spiritually, intellectually, culturally, to enhance the capacities of the human being.
Right.
Okay, he said this. And then Emerson sends the platform at the Masonic Temple in Boston to launch his first series of lectures, in which he's not being sponsored by a lyceum or the Boston Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. Emerson has, in fact, decided to go out on his own as a freelance. Remember, he's already resigned from the ministry, at least from a pulpit in an ordained over a congregation.
Right.
He is freelance preaching.
Yeah.
But now, instead of depending upon an elite group to say, and now we bring you Ralph Waldo Emerson, he announces in the newspapers in an ad that he's going to give this series of 6-7 lectures.
Yeah.
He says, you can buy tickets at the bookstores, and he names the bookstores. He hires the hall. He hires a man to do the gas lighting in the Masonic Temple, and everything is entrepreneurial.
Right.
And when he steps forward before the audience in the Masonic Temple, he announces as an introductory lecture that he's going to define the age. And what is the characteristic of the age? It's not what it once was.
Right.
When societies put their own, and governments put their own agendas ahead of the individual. And if the individual got in the way, they sacrifice him to the needs of state and society.
Right.
He says, but now the modern mind sees the individual as the essential unit of society. And the aim of the state and society is the guardianship and education of the individual. Yeah. So they are both seeing a fundamental transformation in human affairs. Thoreau has probably developed his point of view not from talks with Emerson, whom he hasn't yet gotten to know when he's graduating.
Right.
But he has.
He even skipped Emerson's famous speech, right?
Right.
His
but
yeah.
He has borrowed nature from the Harvard Library in April 1837 and renewed it 2 months later. And he was so impressed that he gave a copy as a present to one of his classmates on graduation. And there's no doubt that he's being influenced by his reading of nature when he gives that commencement speech, because he talks about the religious sentiment, and the lower uses of nature are for the commercial spirit to achieve wealth. Right. The higher uses are philosophy and beauty. Right. So you can see the circulation of a set of ideas between the two of them, and that both in 1837 want to distinguish their moment in time historically as representing something new under the sun.
I totally agree with you. I think that also, like the very beginning of Transcendentalism is sort of like this shift in America, in American thought. All of the stuff that we have inherited and all of the whole like patriotic fervor. All right, so we have a nation, like what are we actually going to do with it? Let's make it be something that's an intellectual pursuit rather than, this big nation state that controls all of us. Like, let's figure out our own individual independent thought. Yeah. And no, it's funny. I was going to say the Thoreau quote makes me think of Facebook actually, and like a lot of the whole idea of the moguls and stuff that we have nowadays, and the billionaires who are going off in this whole pursuit of wealth, because at one point, like all of technology was thought of as noble and sharing information with the world, and now it's sort of veered off into this whole how much money can we all make.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that movement from utopian dreams being projected upon a new innovation only to produce vast disillusion when people are more interested in the money to be made than the original values. That is such a recurrent theme in our history that I wouldn't say that it's some new development that we should blame the internet. It's been there from the start. When the city upon a hill founded by the Puritans turned out to be more interested in catching fish and cod than in saving souls, you had the first Jeremiads about America losing its way. I think what is telling, though, about the moment of 1837 is that it is also marking in Concord the coming together of a variety of forces to produce a major political crisis in the town and a religious crisis in the town. And the Transcendentalists in their world, essentially, in the first half of the book, tries to tell you how Concord underwent this transformation in every sphere of life. And the second half of the book introduces Emerson and Thoreau and tracks their careers in relation to the continuing changes in Concord. And I do that by trying to integrate the careers of Emerson and Thoreau with their ideas in the unfolding history. So if we go back to that moment in 1837, when I said Emerson is giving these lectures, he's printed up the tickets, he's sold them. He's an entrepreneur, but he's an entrepreneur of an interesting sort. At home in Concord, he gathers up the resources in his mind and on his land, and in his walks on Walden to Walden. He gathers up the resources to put together lectures that he will take down to Boston and sell, just like the Concord farmers were doing as they raised their crops and brought them to market in Boston.
Here's a bushel of words for you.
A bushel of words, yes. Am I paid by the word? So, so he's doing that, and having jettisoned any institutional endorsements to back his lecture. No blurbs, no one.
Right.
He steps forth on the lecture platform as a single individual alone.
Right.
And what is the central theme of his lecture? The modern mind knows that society was made for the individual.
Right.
That is, he's literally enacting the emergence of the individual from institutional supports, from the web of community, from even marriage, family. He stands alone, and he says in these lectures, and now for the first time, man utters the awful words, I am. He says, this is the age of the first person singular.
Yeah.
So that announcement of the coming of the individual is not just a theme of his work, it's a role that he's enacting for himself in a break with past practices for educated men. And it's tied to this set of changes in Concord, which are releasing the individual from a variety of what I call in the book, inherited institutions and involuntary associations. And that happens in the name of autonomy and choice for the individual. We can go through some of those.
Well, so wait, I actually wanted to say that, like, in the very beginning of the book, like the moment that you actually start with is the first memory that Thoreau has of visiting Walden Pond.
Right.
And I think that because the book is, semi, you're semi trying to construct this timeline, and it feels like of all the starting points, that's a really interesting one that you're choosing. It's an emotional thing of of a child just connecting with nature. So before we dive back into the book, because there's plenty to talk about, I always like to talk about the guest's own starting points in history, because I feel like this is a very important piece for me to know about you and other history, as a budding history nerd, or maybe a potential historian myself.
Mm-hmm.
What was your own first moment that got you into the whole idea of Transcendentalists and Concord?
Well, I would say first that you could put the question by asking more personally, what's a nice Jewish boy from Bridgeport, Connecticut, wandering into Yankee Protestant Concord?
You said it with me, but yeah.
One of the interesting things about that is that the original settlers of Concord in 1635 involved two groups who combined, and they actually had two ministers, Peter Buckley and a second minister named John Jones. Once they moved here and tried to carve out a living, they realized they really couldn't afford as large a group, and Buckley was the superior. So Jones leads a group of people out of Concord to settle in the new town of Fairfield, Connecticut, where in an area of Fairfield that where I grew up in Bridgeport borders immediately on. So I may have been fated to study Concord by moving from Bridgeport, a now industrial factory city of immigrants, to Concord.
Right.
Not that. So that's one thing. Second is, when I was in college, I mentioned this in the acknowledgments, I took American Studies 11, and the professor who taught that course posed really sharply for us the question, how do you get Puritan New England with its focus on community and controls over the individual, giving way in some form to 19th century Transcendentalists New England, jettisoning the community and celebrating the individual? That question always stuck with me. It stuck with me in particular after writing the Minutemen and Their World to come back to, because the question many visitors to Concord ask is, why Concord? How did this town become the home of two revolutions? One for political independence, the other, it said, quoting James Russell Lowell, for intellectual independence. One for a unique form of government, the other for a unique form of society and culture. There are two primary explanations. One is Concord was a pastoral place, remote from the Industrial Revolution and the rapid changes of the time. And it was really fit for poets and philosophers. That seems like a romantic idea, and you think to yourself, what kind of intellectual life is one that doesn't engage the world in its times? Why would we want to read that? To be fair, maybe what they meant was Concord offered a distance from the hubbub of cities, the conflict, the crowds, the numbers, and in that sense, you could contemplate. Nonetheless, it's false. Concord was not remote from the times.
Right.
Okay. The second is what the Minutemen began, the Transcendentalists continued. Like there's an inheritance that's being seized upon and broadened. But the trouble with that idea is it avoids the question, really, how did the Transcendentalists get the memo? They weren't there at the reading of the will of the Minutemen to know that, we charge you with continuing our legacy.
Right.
And in any case, the legacy can't be the same in that one is community focused, the second is individual.
Well,
More,
wait. So can I actually stop
yeah.
you right there? Because it's always occurred to me that Emerson and Thoreau had, the older men in the community, as they were growing up, in and around Concord, that here were these veterans, and like that they're not literally giving them a memo, but like these are the legends that they're hearing, right? Like these are things that are coming in, maybe subliminally, subconsciously, maybe they're literally hearing it at the market and stuff, but or the town
Well,
square.
yes and no, but I mean, actually, I was just say the third point is
Yeah.
Emerson and Thoreau don't make a big deal of the American Revolution. I mean,
Right.
that's
Right.
search their writings to read their great testimony. Thoreau says actually at one point in A Week on the Concord Merrimack, that um, Concord is actually pursued like the river, a remarkably moderate course in the revolution, and that is correct.
Huh.
Um, Thoreau's grandfather, great grandfather, on his mother's side,
Yeah.
was a loyalist and one of the most powerful friends of government in all provincial Massachusetts.
Right. Right.
Emerson's grandfather on his mother's side was probably royalist leaning and a neutral and a member of King's Chapel. He didn't leave, he didn't become a loyalist,
Yeah.
unlike many on the Thoreau mother's side. But so you have a really complicated set of issues regarding the American Revolution.
Mhm.
Maybe that's one reason each stayed away in large part. I mean,
Right.
after Emerson gives the historic address at Concord's bicentennial celebration, in which he endorses we're the town where the revolution began, and after he writes the Concord hymn, he's done with that subject.
That's enough. I'm done.
Yeah,
All there is to say.
yeah.
Yeah.
And what does he do? He writes immediately after the Concord hymn. After while he's doing this, he also begins Nature. Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers,
Mm.
in which he implies that, and our generation is being buried under them.
Well, right. And so here's another like modern parallel, because I always feel like the transcendentalists are kind of the hippies of their day in many ways. So part of it is also they're steeped in all of this history
Mhm.
so much that they actually want to reject it and just bury it, because everything, history is old and dusty, and it's only important for the people who are alive now to make something of ourselves intellectually, right? Like that, maybe that was their approach.
The only thing that interests him about biography and history is to show that the people he studies and lectures about were themselves having their own original relation to the universe.
Exactly.
He doesn't mind showing you that other people have done so, but you've got to figure out your own path. You can't
Yeah.
do theirs.
Yeah.
You
And
know?
sometimes it's easier to relate to the ancient Greeks or, ancient history rather than something that's too close.
One of the mysteries to me when I was writing about, the series of lectures he gave on great men, which preceded philosophy of modern history, is that no great man was an American in his set. And it's surprising because in studies of biography in the early American Republic, who do you think the most popular subjects were? Benjamin Franklin,
Franklin, right?
George Washington.
Thomas Jefferson, that's yeah.
Not
Not so
but really Washington
Franklin.
and Franklin, and um, they were logical candidates.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that he avoided them. And I think it may be that he was drawing on his own reading in college, so it was easier to do.
Yeah.
Um, or he just didn't know how he was going to cope with all the things that Parson Weems had written about Washington and Franklin's. I mean, Franklin's focus on the utilitarian was so heavy
Yeah.
that Emerson then would have had trouble with the uses of nature at a higher level.
So how do you, it's so fun. So like generally as a historian, I feel like there's a lot of legend stuff to contend with, right? And these like not even the egos, but the legends of people in the biography, exactly what you're talking about, after people die, right? And how to deal with that as a historian, to dig into like primary sources to figure out the difference between, oh, George Washington was this great man, blah, blah, blah. But then, he also had his bad days, and he was also a human, and he had all these other things. How do you, as a historian, sort of break that apart? Like what, and I sort of want to ask, what is your personal relationship to Emerson and Thoreau? And do you have to sort of put them in boxes, or how do you tease all that apart?
Well, I didn't come to this project as a card carrying transcendentalist. I didn't have a sort of, great admiration for Ralph Waldo Emerson. I did have a kind of liking for Thoreau, came of age in the mid 1960s when Thoreau was as popular then for his rejection of war and slavery and oppression and speaking for nature, and rejecting an older generation that had lots of appeal. Oddly, there's no major song about Thoreau written during the 60s. There should have been. Phil Oakes or Dylan could have come up with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Hey, Bob Dylan, come on.
yeah, you got the Nobel Prize, spend it a little.
Oh,
So,
too late. Send him a
but
letter.
but I was interested as a social historian in this large change.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, and this is really key, I was part of a whole movement, which I continue to be committed to, of writing the most inclusive history you could. We used to talk about history from the bottom up.
Yeah.
For some people, that meant doing labor history or the history of enslaved Black people and free people of color, history of women. But I've thought of it as from the bottom up, the top down, the middle out, that everybody's got a part. And I try to reconstruct that.
Yeah.
And in so doing, a key to my study of Concord in the Transcendentalists is to take the people, Abel Moore, the progressive farmer, Samuel Hoare, the man Emerson admired immensely, George Minot, the farmer who lived on Lexington Road, who barely ever left his house or tiny, tiny estate.
Yeah.
Ellery Channing certainly was aware of them. So was Sanborn. So were all the people who've written about Concord and the Transcendentalists. But all those people are seen through the Emerson or Thoreau gaze.
Right. Right.
They don't exist except as they mattered to Emerson and Thoreau, which means if we don't have a sense of their larger world, we can't even understand how Emerson and Thoreau selected out of the range of things they could have known
Right.
to come up with the people. Minot George is a particularly interesting case because he's in a vague way a relative of Thoreau's by virtue of Thoreau's grandmother's second marriage to Jonas Minot, whose house stood more or less where the Thoreau birth farm now is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Jonas Minot came from an elite family. His mother and father's side were at the top of the social order in Concord in the mid 18th century. And one, the Minot, was actually on the Royal Governor's Council. I mean, he's really zoomed up. His father served in the Revolutionary War as a Continental, gets injured, comes back to Concord, and apparently drank away a lot of the rest of his life.
God.
The family is downwardly mobile. They own a lot of good furniture and other objects in the house, but not a lot of income coming in. So, for one thing, by the time George is coming of age, he wants to go off to Maine. And his mother says, if you stay here, his widowed mother, if you stay here with your sister Mary, who's a tailoress, if you stay here, I'll pay you this much a year and you'll get it with the inheritance.
Right.
So when she dies, there's not enough money in the estate to pay all the claims. Now, the claims are actually mostly George's and his sister's, but because they're fixed debts, they actually have to sell off the property to raise the money to pay the debts. So George is actually having to buy what he should have inherited.
Right. Ugh.
He is downwardly mobile
Right.
without the political and social capital, without the material means to do anything more than have a tiny plot of land to farm.
Yeah.
He turns that into a positive. He brags he never took a crop to market. He never went to Boston but once in the War of 1812 when his unit of the militia was called out and he got homesick and went back to Concord and deserted. He doesn't join any voluntary societies. He doesn't worship at the first church. He doesn't vote. He said, why vote? Better to make decisions with a gun than a ballot.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he could have been
But
there.
I like, yeah, no, other than that, he sounds a lot like Thoreau, right? All of that
He is,
very familiar,
and he's
Hung out
about
together.
2 years of age before or after John Thoreau, Henry's father.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so Thoreau is going talking to him all the time about what were the old days like. Tell me. And George is telling him that back in the 1780s and 1790s, when I was a young man coming in, this was a much wilder place. You could
Back in the day, man. Yeah.
So Thoreau's getting his whole sense of the rougher, wilder Concord, where nature could still be seen much more, if you will, in the raw, from George Minot
Right.
and then from others.
Right.
But notice the way in which talk about selecting out. When George Minot, this is a really funny thing I discovered in the records. When his mother dies and they settle the estate, he puts in his bill, the appraisers of the estate have to figure out how much of the claims to pay. They got Mary's claims and they got George's claims. Right. Three of the most progressive, capitalist-minded farmers in Concord are the appraisers. And they read over George's claim and they say, it's a pretty small piece of land. Anybody else could have done this in much quicker time and at lower cost. So they slashed down his legitimate claims. Thoreau admires George Minot for caring so much about nature that every stalk of corn matters to him. That he doesn't leave, after he's taken the ears off, the stubble to rot in the ground. He takes it and he dries it so we fodder for his one cow, and he takes so good care of his animals. So Thoreau admires the deliberate way in which George Minot farms, exactly the opposite of what the appraisers were looking for.
Right.
So I tell his story in the book, and you get a sense that, well, not exactly everything that Henry tells us. And we on the one hand, we can see certainly why Henry found him.
Yeah.
But Minot's story is also kind of a poignant story of loss.
Right.
Maybe he didn't want that high social place of his grandfather, but maybe he would have never minded.
Well, right, but it's funny to see the influences, and I love how you, like, one of the things I have noticed, sort of just rifling through and going through the index and stuff, is that you're bringing up all of these amazing tiny details and stories. So there's another story about Kai's, right, was teasing George Frisbee Hoare, the squire's son. And you talk about like how Kai, and we know Kai is from like the parking lot, and like there are a lot of these family names that are still plentiful around Concord. But you talk about Kai's like being a bully towards Hoare, and then Hoare like throws a rock at him and damages his two front teeth. So Kai's has like this big gap like for the rest
of his life.
He was
probably never known for his whistle.
Right, but like all of these fun little details. So like, all right, so you live in Concord now, right? How long, like when did you move to Concord?
Well, we've been in and out. So we moved here in 1972 when I was writing my dissertation
Mhm.
Instead of writing exactly the dissertation, I wrote The Minutemen and Their World, which became my dissertation. So, and then Amherst College hired me
Yeah.
in 76. So we moved out to Amherst. I came back here for several summers,
Right.
then for a leave of absence, for a fellowship year, 79, 80,
Yeah.
later in the 90s for several summers in a row. And so I was always sort of back and forth, and keeping in mind doing this book on the Transcendentalists. I taught about Emerson and Dickinson, Emily Dickinson and Thoreau, and of course on Concord and Amherst at Amherst College.
Yeah.
Um, and so, we've had several sojourns, and we bought a house in Concord 2011, rented it out for a few years, and
Okay.
moved here in 2014.
Wow. Yeah. So my the question that I am sort of getting around to asking is, like, if you could talk to that that younger version of yourself in 1972, when you first really set foot in Concord as starting to be a citizen, or starting to live as part of like the Concord life, what would you say were your biggest surprises? Or what kind of advice would you give that person, that younger version of yourself?
Huh. Well, part of me wants to say write quicker and get this thing done, but the truth is that um, I love teaching,
Mm,
and so threw much of and I got to teach a lot of this, but I threw much of myself into it,
yeah.
and that was enormously satisfying. Advising theses, so the career that distracted was a fulfilling career.
Mm,
Um, I still, I wish maybe I was done 10 years sooner than I am. One of the things I learned, not in the Minutemen, well, in the Minutemen, I went to write this book thinking it'd be a quickie for the bicentennial. And
understand. Yeah.
moved here, an anti-war, long-haired, anti-Vietnam War, long-haired activist. And I came to know people here. I think this really, who had helped form the reenactment Concord Minutemen Company. Concord was a place when in the early 70s, Memorial Day, the Concord Minutemen came out, or somebody with a fife and drum, a small group of people to honor Concord's dead in the war. And despite my politics, came to know a lot of people for whom I had enormous respect for their commitment to community, whatever their partisan differences.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
would be one thing. So that when I wrote the Minutemen, it was not with any um, attempt to expose anything, but to try to understand that world.
Right.
Likewise with the Transcendentalists, I think that when I started as an academic and when I was out at Amherst and after, there was a kind of moment that academic historians looking at figures like Emerson and Thoreau, we're in looking for gotcha moments. See, look, he complains about the curse of trade, Thoreau, but look at how his family's dependent upon the capitalist market, and he
Right.
never admits his complicity.
Right.
Well, okay, I could have ended up publishing a book on gotcha,
Right.
but now with some distance, what would we have learned from that other than they too were members of their own society? So
Yeah.
I think that what I really gained from the long period of writing this book is to think about ideas of community and individual, the ones we began with,
Mhm.
and their ways in which they changed and continue to have force in our time. For all that I researched the book and wrote articles for many years,
Yeah.
I wrote the Transcendentalists in the World mostly between 2015 and 2020. Not the happiest time in our republic,
Well, right.
and especially with COVID, not a time in which all Americans rallied together in the face of an existential crisis and said, we owe it to each other. And so I began to really care in this book about ideas of interdependence. Ezra Ripley, the longtime minister of Concord and step grandfather of Waldo, preached over and over and over again. Now, when he said we're all interdependent, he also kind of presumed that there was a hierarchy that kept us so. And he imagined a homogeneous society.
Hmm.
Emerson and Thoreau are part of a rejection of that ideology of interdependence in its strongest form. And they're really saying, let the individual emerge. Let's have a voluntary society.
Right.
At their most forceful, they can sound pretty libertarian with
Okay.
little in the way of acknowledgement of how we need each other.
Yeah.
You want that, go ask Lydian and Mary Moody Emerson and Margaret Fuller, not Waldo.
Right. Right.
But, nonetheless, the tension then between a society organized around the individual and a society of interdependence, that's a perennial one. And as I got thinking and writing the book about the politics of the Republic, look at the ways in which now New England, pretty much blue politically, is also most oriented. People always say it's like Western Europe, two ideas of interdependence, social democracy and the like. I am not trying to overstate the matter, but certainly compared to the South, where you have some combination of legacies of slavery and racism with libertarianism, which might be Southern planters saying, stay out of our lives. So I thought a lot, I am not making a broad case in the book about regions in America, but I am, I think, trying to imagine how it is that we have as inheritances here in Concord, in Massachusetts, New England, and the country, how it is that we have both a strong sense of interdependence and what I would call a spiritual idealism imbued into our individualism.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and bringing up the idea of slavery too, because I feel like that whole piece of it somewhat taints this whole idea of spiritualism, or living true to some version of spirituality, and how Emerson didn't really speak out against slavery for a long, long time. Oh, and I also wanted to mention, so you're also a member of the board of the Robbins House.
I'm an advisor. I'm
You're
not
an
on the board of directors, but I've
Yeah.
I've been working with them for the 10 years or so when they got started. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So what has that work been like? And how do you see it evolving as a piece of it? Because the Robbins House is sort of the major destination, and it's this documented house that had been in the hands of an African American family for for not long enough, but there was documentation about
Right.
the Ellen Garrison especially,
Right.
I want to say. Yeah.
Well, this would be a whole other interview, I think, to go
Yeah.
through that in detail. But it's been a process of unending discovery.
Mm.
Um, at any given time in the colonial period and then into the period before the Civil War, Concord had 2 to 3 dozen people of color living here of African descent.
Right.
And that's actually not a lot. Typically 3 or 4 families and some individuals not in families.
Right.
But it turns out that that number constitutes anywhere between 1.5% and 2.5% of the total population,
Yeah.
which is in fact the average for Massachusetts in those years.
Yeah.
So Concord actually is not, if you look at it this way, you can say, that's interesting. So actually it's pretty representative.
Right.
And then you discover that between 1800 and 1860, many towns in Massachusetts that had once had people of color have seen those people leave, move to Boston or New Bedford particularly,
Right.
and they become all white.
Mm.
Not true in Concord through 1850.
Yeah.
And so we might want to make a guess that the Black families who lived here meant to live here and work to stay here.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that,
so wait, but it's interesting that you choose 1850 as sort of like the year that ends, kind of, because that's the year of the fugitive slave law.
Right, but that wouldn't have been the key. But by 1860, Concord has trickled down to about 8 or 10 people of color.
Okay.
I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why people might leave. You might like want to live someplace where you can see people like you and build a community.
Right.
I think that what is interesting is that from 1790, at the end of slavery,
Mhm.
to 1820 or so in Concord, the people of color were were on the margins.
Mm.
Not entirely. The Dugans got settled here in the south part of Amherst and seem to have been integrated into their rural neighborhood. But from the mid 1820s on, I think there's considerably more um, integration, not in the way we think about civil rights laws and integration, but just considerably more participation and involvement in interaction between people of color and the rest of the community.
Right. I think one of the first articles of yours that I read, or where I noticed your name, I think was about the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's so Susan Robbins is a founding member. Susan Robbins Garrison is a founding member of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1837, and that's not just a small fact; it's a crucial one because to Garrison and his supporters uh, wanting to fight for equal rights as well as for an end to slavery,
Yeah.
their aim was to work hand in hand with Black activists.
Exactly. Instead
So,
of having even those groups designated, right?
right.
So yeah.
So the participation of Ellen Garrison in the founding helps to manifest the commitment to Black-white cooperation in that era's civil rights movement.
Yeah. Yeah. And Henry's mother as well was one of the founding members, and his sister Helen, and you know.
And when Henry's mother was living on the Minot farm in 1810, the fascinating thing is that that was the year that Jack Garrison, or right around the year, that Jack Garrison decamped from New Jersey and came to Concord and found a place. And we know this through the oddest of things. Henry, writing in his journal in the 1850s, says, "Mother remembered the cold Friday when they were doing dishes in the probably the kitchen, and the water froze on the dishes as we cleaned them." And she remembers, I forget the name of the woman who was there, but she remembers the Garrison was in the kitchen.
Ah,
And
yeah.
so that's must have been the first place that Jack Garrison landed on arriving in Concord. Now, remember one of the key things before we say, oh, what a nice story about the Thoreaus and Cynthia, and they're living in the same house with a Black man who's fled slavery.
Mm.
Elijah Jones, the grandfather of Cynthia Thoreau, was not only a provincial leader, a loyalist, and a wealthy landholder, he was also a slaveholder.
Yeah.
So Thoreau's family had slaveholding in their back.
Wow. I don't think I ever knew that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is like, I definitely feel like this is the day and age where I'm more interested in transparency. And I think a lot of other people are kind of like,
Mm-hmm.
I just want the truth. I just want to know what actually
Mm-hmm.
happened. And, and it's not about gotcha. It's not about blaming people, but it's just kind of like, how, how were these families passing down values from one generation to the next?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. So the
Yeah.
more we know the truth,
Yeah.
the more deeply embedded we realize the society was in injustices of all sorts, slavery and the dispossession of Native peoples, the most egregious.
Yeah.
But the more we know that, the more I think we'll get over our current moment of how can you admire this person? How can this one? I mean, look, the fact is, inequality and injustice, oppression, enslavement
Yeah.
are virtually constants of human history.
Sadly, yes.
The moments when we're not, when they aren't, are the exception.
Right.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to write history in which you just keep condemning everybody who came before as if you have superior wisdom.
Right.
When the people who can write about us are going to find an awful lot to see as blind spots.
Yeah.
So my goal in this book was to show what the stakes were in terms that are meaningful to us, but to try to reveal the people I'm writing about in their terms.
Right.
You know, I always used to say to students that if these people knew that they were going to, if John Winthrop knew that, and Peter Buckley knew that they were going to lead up to us, you think they would have turned the boat around and gone back to England?
That's an excellent question, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So, you know, I think we have to honor the impulses of people we study who are trying to make a better life, even if their better life could be profoundly flawed in its assumptions.
Right. Right. One question that I always want to ask historians is there a journal or like a holy grail of a question that you've never been able to answer and that you sort of had like as a bugaboo or like something like in your head of like, if I can only find the answer to this question, this is going to be, you know.
Well, I used to say when I finished the Minutemen that if I could get them to come and read my book, could they tell me if they thought I got it right? You know, maybe I'd say the same thing. But no. The reason is that when I teach seminars and I give talks, I always want to find the place where I didn't get it right
Mm.
and want to ask a new question.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
You know, I want to say, but I had a blind spot about this. Now, how do I take it apart again?
Huh. Yeah.
You know, so
Yeah. Huh.
the Transcendentalists in the World, for all the many pages you've got there, I end it with Emerson on the verge of a national career
Right.
and Thoreau out of Walden, back home, well, actually back in Emerson's house, but with
And,
his first, with the first draft of Walden. So
yeah.
I've got a bunch of years now after that to ask questions that might take everything in here apart.
Right. No, so I'd heard that you ended it like right in 1847, right? Which is sort of like, I think definitely, you know, like it's sort of like one of the high points. You know, it's years before Walden gets published. It's years before, you know, Henry still has so much more of his journal to write, and there's still so much more
Yeah,
to do. You know.
and Henry's training of himself as a naturalist
Mm-hmm.
and his ups and downs in publishing, well, those we know pretty well, but his training himself as a naturalist would have involved my story in a whole lot of other work. And actually, I think I would say, not so sure that for Thoreau, Concord mattered a lot as the lab site in which he studied nature.
Mm-hmm.
But things unique to Concord, I think, were less important thereafter than generally things happening in Massachusetts and the nation.
Ah.
Likewise for Emerson. In my view, Emerson moves to Concord in the fall of 1834, doesn't really settle in until 35 when he decides, I'm going to stay here.
Right.
He gives these lectures on the philosophy of modern history from 1847 to 41. In there, he lays out his most fundamental and radical ideas, including the modern mind and the individual.
Yeah.
What is he doing in those years? He is settling into a new home, a new town. And when you move someplace new, your antennae are out. Your eyes are acutely watching. What's this new place like?
Yeah.
And so what he's doing is he didn't become a transcendentalist because he lived in Concord. He already had a lot of these ideas. But Concord gives him a stage on which he can perceive and connect with and enact his observations and take them and merge them with what he's seen in Boston for the illustrations in his lectures.
Yeah.
That I think is crucial. Essays first series, essays second series, a lot of that material traces straight back to the lectures, which trace straight back to the journal entries, which trace straight back to running into Cyrus Stowe when he was turning from Cambridge Turnpike onto Lexington Road over to Walden Street. You know, running into Daniel Shattuck and others and recording that. And so I would argue, though I'm sure I could be challenged, that it's those lectures which made his mark represent his engagement with Concord in his formative way.
Right. Because so the way that you're explaining it makes me rethink something that, like, not only was he deciding to settle in Concord, but that he was realizing that he was going to manifest this idea of the Transcendentalists in that location, right? So I run a group online, Transcendental Concord, and every so often the idea of, like, what is the definition of a Transcendentalist, right, really comes up. And everybody sort of says, well, you know, the original group, everybody had their own idea of what that meant, you know, but, and I still feel it's sort of an amorphous idea.
So Henry Ware Jr. and especially Andrews Norton, when Emerson came out, when Emerson came out with the book Nature, conservative Unitarians criticized him and criticized the Transcendentalists like George Ripley and Frederick Henry Hedge as well, for all this Germanic prose and using words in ways they didn't expect, and being so vague as they couldn't answer the question, what's the definition of Transcendentalism? So when your online group asks impatiently, give me the definition, they're siding with Andrews Norton. And so take that.
Exactly. Bring that back to them.
But I would say the more important, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but to me in the book, the more important question is not why Transcendentalism. Your question kind of implies.
Yeah.
It's why Transcendentalism in New England and Massachusetts between 1833-34, when essays about German idealism and Coleridge and Carlyle begin to appear in the Unitarian magazine. Why between 1833 and 1836, 37? Why then and there?
Yeah.
And that proved to be, for me, an incredibly useful question, because I realized what happened in 1833-34. Massachusetts voted to disestablish Congregationalism.
Yeah.
And January 1st, 1834 opens a new era of religious voluntarism and pluralism.
Right.
By 1837, Concord has a Unitarian, Trinitarian, Baptist, Methodist, and Universalist congregation. Within 3 years, Ezra Ripley, who for most of his tenure had one town, one church, faces competition.
Right.
That's intense. So why Transcendentalism then? I think Transcendentalism is initially an answer to how do we compete? Why? What the Transcendentalists say is the essence of religion. It's not a building. You could worship God in a cathedral or on a mountaintop.
Right.
It's not a creed, because people are disagreeing all the time about creeds. It's not a mode of church governance. You know, you've got, the Quakers with their monthly meetings. You've got the hierarchy of Anglicanism or the Catholic Church. It can't be that. They go through, it can't be just a code of morals because they differ.
Right.
So in effect, what Emerson says and what his colleagues say is it's nothing like that. Religion is a spirit of divinity that you know in your heart when you're truest to your sentiments, and you can feel it in nature.
Yeah.
What they're saying is that we have an answer to how to compete for religious adherence. And that was like libertarianism. This is an answer to a particular concern, but this is then married to democracy and equality, which are surging as demands in 1820s, 1830s, 40s America.
Yeah.
So they then extend so what are the consequences of believing that every individual is part and particle of the divine soul, which translated in modern terms, I would say,
Yeah.
you and I might say we all share a common humanity. I think Emerson was saying we all share a common divinity.
Right. Right.
We share divine nature. But if we say that, then every child is free and equal, each with infinite possibility. And that then means that all hierarchies topple. All inequalities, inequities, and injustice must go. And slavery is by nature wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the question then became not why transcendentalism, but why transcendentalism then in
Right.
that setting. And the book tries to explain that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think especially, at least for me, I've always mentally sort of dated the beginning of that to when Emerson leaves the ministry. You know, his wife has died the year before, and he's in this like, dark night of the soul. And he's getting to that point, and he's realizing that he can't, he wants to topple that hierarchy, exactly as you're saying.
Right. But remember, Megan Marshall would remind you that Elizabeth Palmer Peabody was into this by 1825.
I can't say enough about Elizabeth Palmer Peabody. She's great, and I feel like she's very precocious in so many ways.
Right.
Yeah. Anyway, so this has been a marvelous hour. Thank you so much for granting me your time. I was very lucky to get your book.
Yeah, look at that.
And I've been, I found it at a Concord bookshop, and and have been devouring it. So thank you very much for writing it. Thank you for completing it, sharing it with the world. And as you said before, like, you've cut a lot out of it, and I'm looking forward to a volume 2.
Well, anyway, thank you very much. This has been fun talking with you.
Absolutely. And thank you all. If you want to find out about more Concord Days, go to transcendentalconcord.com or .org. And thank you very much. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye.